the Conscious Style podcast, where we explore what it will take to build a better, more sustainable, and equitable future for fashion. I'm your host, Elizabeth Joy. Now let's dive into today's episode. Hey there, and welcome back to the Conscious Style podcast. We are diving really deep in today's episode with Sophia Yang, who is the founder and executive director of Threading Change, a youth-led ethical fashion organization that works at the intersections of climate, gender, and racial justice in alignment with the necessary transition to a circular economy. You are going to hear about how colonialism not only shaped fashion, but is still embedded in how the industry operates today, what equity really is, and how we must address exploitation in fashion at its core, and how colonialism is connected to fashion's inequities, the realities of racism and colonialism in not just fast fashion, but the conscious fashion space as well, and why we need to decentralize and decolonize the Eurocentric understanding of land and labor in the fashion space. As I said, this episode is diving really deep, so if you are newer to ethical fashion, I definitely recommend listening to the first 5 or so episodes, the introductory episodes, because the discussions here will make a lot more sense and you'll have more context for some of the references made here. And we are going to dive in just a moment here, but I wanted to let you know that this is part 1 of the conversation with Sophia. So part 2 will be going live next week. So make sure that you are subscribed or following on your podcast app so that you do not miss the second part of this conversation, because I promise you it's just as good as this first part is going to be. And also, if you are liking the Conscious Style podcast so far, it would mean so much if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. This really helps the show and the content reach new audiences and shouldn't take more than 5 seconds for a rating and a minute for a review. Thank you in advance. All right, now let's get to what you have been waiting for, the interview. Sophia is going to start us off here with an introduction, sharing some background on herself and how and why she founded the ethical fashion organization Threading Change.
My name is Sophia. My Chinese name is Yang Ya Cheng. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm joining you today from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, aka Vancouver and Western Canada. So my story starts when I immigrated from China to Canada when I was 8 years old. We first lived in Calgary, and then I moved to Vancouver when I was 17 to go to the University of British Columbia studying natural resources conservation. And I was inspired to really dive into a career in environmentalism and sustainability when I read an article at the age of 11 that was by Dr. David Suzuki discussing what kids can do to raise awareness about global warming, it was called at the time. So I've always been a climate activist at heart, advocating for planetary health and also the need to ensure that we keep our planet not just good for future generations, but for current generations as well. It was when I attended the United Nations Framework Convention Climate Change's COP conference in Madrid in 2019 December, where I stumbled into the 1-year anniversary signing event of the UN Fashion Charter. And at this event, it was essentially a convergence of industry leaders, government officials, and also those working in the fashion industry and also banking institutions coming together to talk about sustainable fashion, and how for the first time in history, this is landmark agreement with industry and also governments working via policy instruments and other forms to transform the industry. And it was when I was at this event that I really felt like while they did a great job capturing the need for environmental protection and ensuring that we reduce climatic emissions in the fashion industry, I didn't feel like they really touched on the intersectional aspects of fashion. As we know, fashion has many issues ranging from climate injustice, ranging from unfair and inequitable labor practices, not centering gender equity, also the lack of racial diversity. And I also felt at this event that there was not enough recognition of those in the global south. Millions of garment workers around the world, 90% of them being women, that are spending 90% of their day either making 10 cents an hour or not making any money at all, making our clothing. So I really want to start Threading Change, which is a play on word of spreading change, to really encapsulate the importance of upholding intersectionality and also justice and equity in our fashion conversation. And that in order to ensure that we are moving into a better and newer fashion system that really centers ethical fashion, which means we're not just thinking about the planetary bounds of fashion, but also thinking about people as well. So beyond just emissions reduction, but more into how we can envision a better fashion system that's fair and equitable for all. And for me, I've always had a really strong interest in fashion. In 2018, I made the switch to change all my clothing to be thrifted, secondhand, clothing swap, and vintage. But another reason why I wanted to start threading change was I noticed that a lot of people around me were resorting to retail therapy or shopping a lot as a way to cope with the pandemic. And while I totally understand that, I even did a bit of that myself in the beginning. I think it's a very dangerous method, how fast fashion companies have thrusted this model of gross capitalist consumption upon us. As Rosella de Castro said, she's a great activist in the fashion space. She founded Fashion Revolution. She was saying that no one was born to want to buy 30 pairs of jeans in 1 year. We're not born to be fast fashion consumers. These fast fashion brands have put these capitalist models on us and almost tricked us in a way with clever marketing schemes for us to think this way. And I think that's a very true sentiment in that in truly changing the fashion industry, it's a lot about people coming together and working within the intersectional realms to ensure that we envision a better fashion future for everybody.
Absolutely. So, a lot of your work with Threading Change is centered on equity. And today in the fashion industry, while we are seeing some small efforts made by brands to be more diverse or really appear to be more diverse, we're not really seeing any real shifts in power or real efforts towards equity. For example, we see fast fashion brands with more diverse marketing campaigns while they continue to exploit garment makers who are disproportionately women of color in the global south and also in countries in the global north as well, appropriate cultures or even steal designs, and lack inclusivity and representation in positions of real power, such as the executive suite or the board, these people who have the ability to make important decisions in the brands and the organizations. So, given your work in this space, how do you think that we can get fashion to move beyond tokenism and actually be more equitable?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think to answer this question, we have to start first by defining equity. So, equity, in the very formal terms, is essentially the quality of being fair and also impartial. So, I think when we say we are working on equity and justice, that's never to be confused with equality. We don't use the term equality because you may have heard or seen that graphic that really showcases the difference between equity and equality. And equality is when there's a systemic barrier in place. So an example can be, a picket fence and people can't see properly. And you give everyone the same ladder, the same height of ladder to make sure they can see over the fence. For someone that's shorter, they still can't see over the fence. Whereas equity is giving people different levels of support to ensure that everyone is able to be on the same level playing field in accessing resources. Whereas in reality, what happens is that there's many times more support for certain groups of people, namely people in the global north, in the reality of today in the fashion ecosystem. And there's not very much support for people in the global south whatsoever. In fact, they're mainly being exploited. And then the end goal is liberation, whereas this systemic barrier, such as defense, is eradicated and everyone has equal access to resources without any further help because this barrier has been removed. In the case of the fashion industry, when it comes to centering equity, the level of support that we must give to whether it's to garment workers, to smaller brands, is ensuring that they have the same level playing field when marketing their products or when ensuring that they have equitable and fair pay. And this is a hard reality to even envision nowadays because the fashion ecosystem, the big fashion train, as you've probably heard many times, it's among one of the most polluting industries in the world. There are so many different actors in the fashion industry, ranging from suppliers, garment workers, retailers, people working out on the design side, consumers, government regulation, that sometimes it's even hard to understand who has the power to actually make these shifts in place. And this is also the issue we run into when I've previously been talking to some clubhouse rooms is like which government body, which legislative body in your region has the power to actually try to get there to be less textile waste going to the landfills, because I tried to explore this issue in Vancouver, Canada, and there was a lot of ping ponging of responsibility between regional governments, provincial governments, and also different retail wholesalers. So as you can see, the ecosystem is incredibly complex, and sometimes it's not easy to see who actually has the power to enact change. But I think once we address the issue at the core, which of the true issue of why we don't have equity in the industry is that the exploitation of workers is something that needs to be eradicated. And I say that because there's so many aspects of the fashion industry that consumers don't even know that's beyond just exploitation and lack of diversity. But it's also the fact that right now the fashion industry is one of the leading contributors to modern day slavery. As you may know, right now, the Uyghur population in northeastern China. So the Uyghur population, they are in that region of China and they are being slaved to work 90% of their day farming for organic cotton. And they don't get paid at all. And there's incredibly tight restrictions on who's able to access these areas. It's very heavily government sanctioned and patrolled. And UNICEF and also Amnesty International have deemed it as one of the highest forms of human rights violations currently. And the reason why it's so problematic is because even though leaders such as Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, have said previously that they are not shipping Uyghur made products into Canada and they're banning it, stores like Zara are still able to sell their products. And the reason why I say it's problematic is because when there was people that was investigating into if there was Uyghur slave labor in Zara's supply chain, they had a sentence or they had like a web page on their website about a month ago that was saying that they don't tolerate any form of slave labor. But then about 3 weeks ago, this webpage mysteriously disappeared with no explanation. And when further asked and to comment on the question, Zara did not provide any more clarification. So it's when there's business practices like this that really makes you raise an eyebrow. And even if we're trying to better the situation, it's still increasingly at a slow pace because these workers are still subject to various forms of abuse. The other thing I would say that when we try to push for more circular fashion and more equity, it's also the fact that we need to think about how these century-old business models of consumption and production needs to stop. So the fashion industry really got a head start because they were able to really get lots of cheap labor overseas. There's a reason why Bangladesh and China are two countries where there's so much clothing being made. The reason is because it's rooted in colonialism. The reason is because there's different trade agreements that were enacted as early as the 1930s that are now able to have really cheap clothing and other goods produced in these countries and upsold for much more without people really batting an eye. So these century-old business models of consumption and production need to stop. And the thing that Spreading Change will always say is that to get to this notion of change, of spreading the change, we need to stop viewing our clothing as commodities, as materialistic goods, and instead view them as stories, as memories, as the gateway to understanding and realizing the difference you want to see in the world.
Yeah, definitely. There was so much there that we could explore deeper, but something I'd like to discuss a little bit more with you is colonialism and racism in fashion. So, in the ethical fashion space, we often talk about these big retailers, these fast fashion brands perpetuating exploitive systems, specifically the exploitation of women of color in the global south, as well as often immigrant women of color in the global north. And brands like Zara, as you mentioned specifically, are perhaps the worst in this system, enabling maybe profiting off of slave labor. And it really does not get worse than that. But while we don't necessarily see this overt exploitation of garment makers in the ethical fashion space, we can still see some of these racist colonial systems at play with things like, say, white saviorism, Eurocentrism. So, could you share your perspective on that and maybe how we can do better in the ethical fashion niche or space?
Absolutely. I just want to bring it back to Zara for 1 second because I think this concept of white saviorism, I want to relate it back to this company. One of the things about Zara is that they're originally made in Spain, and one of the true and equitable parts of the industry that really grinds my gears is that when you talk about fashion, a lot of people think of fashion as a very girly industry or very feminine. First of all, there's nothing wrong with that. But the part of that is if it's really a quote unquote girly industry, then how come 9 out of the 10 of the largest fashion company CEOs are male? So some of these companies I'm talking about are Uniqlo, Zara, Nike, Adidas, Hermes, Louis Vuitton. These brands all have male CEOs, right? So it's a girly industry. Well, then how come people with positions of power or executive power at the top are not women at all? H&M is the only one that has a woman as a CEO. Second of all, 9 out of 10 of these CEOs are white. Of the 10 largest fashion companies in the world, the only one that's not is a CEO of Uniqlo, who is Japanese. Third of all, 8 out of 10 of these CEOs are based in Europe, with only two outside Europe. The only two being Nike and from the US and Uniqlo from Japan. So as you can see, the powerhouses of fashion, where most of the decision is made, all that power is mainly concentrated in Europe, the root of a lot of colonialism in today's world. This is not a coincidence. And the reason why I also mentioned Zara is because Zara actually made over $10 billion in profit since the pandemic had started, whereas many other companies, a lot of smaller clothing brands, have lost a lot of money. I was on a podcast previously, and the host, when I said this part, he said, yeah, I remember, I live in Toronto, in downtown Toronto, and every other store was being closed, but Zara kept changing the window displays. It's because they have a model that people will still want to consume, no matter even if pandemic is happening, because they have cultivated a culture that's easy for you to consume because their clothing are applicable for every single situation. While it is a clever marketing scheme, it's incredibly dangerous because Zara is also one of those companies that really popularized the really, really fast design fashion term. Like Zara has been known to get a design from initial sketching to the garment factory, to the warehouse, to the reseller in as little as 4 days. Can you imagine just drawing up a dress and then literally 72 to 96 hours later, it's in store? That's how fast it is. If that's not the definition of fast fashion, I don't know what is. And in terms of what I've seen in the conscious fashion space and how it can push for better, I've seen a lot of people kind of, call these brands out, Zara included. And I've also seen people that's talking about the intersectionality of fashion, how it must also center people before profit and also the planet as well. But something that's happening that I think is very dangerous is the white saviorism that's happening in the industry. And I say this because, when it comes to talking about ethical fashion, there's a lot of people working in this space that are approaching the topic from a very westernized point of view. And that's not necessarily their fault because some of the earliest people discussing ethical fashion and sustainable fashion are from Europe. There's lots of companies doing great work in those regions. But what's happening is that they have a Eurocentric view of the different solutions they want to be put onto to kind of advance ethical fashion and to combat fast fashion. But we cannot apply band-aid, one-size-fits-all solutions across different continents in the fashion ecosystem. It's just not the same. I mean, take Netherlands, like they can have lots of different programs and educational programs on ethical fashion, but they don't have as many sweatshops, right, in that region. Whereas you can talk about ethical fashion from lens of China, but because China has so many more sweatshops and different factories actually making the clothing, there's going to be different solutions applied to these different regions. And I actually, unfortunately, experienced white saviorism in the fashion industry for the first time recently, where I heard of someone that was working to bring fashion revolution to a certain country, but they don't even speak the language of the country. They don't speak any dialect of the country. They're not from that country. They just worked there recently, and they think they're the right ones to bring the fashion revolution to that region. And when I heard this, I thought to myself, hang on, that really, really bothers me because how can you ensure you're working in a way that benefits the country if you don't even speak the language? You don't even have the lived experience. If you don't even truly understand what's required there, you're still coming in from a Eurocentric perspective on what needs to be quote unquote fixed, what needs to be saved. The people in this country don't need to be saved. They don't need you to fix them or fix anything. They need you to stop exploiting them. As a Westerner coming to a country and saying you're going to bring the fashion revolution, have you thought about how the word revolution in certain countries that are still have different government structures that are a little bit more communist, or perhaps their government structures are more conservative? The word revolution might actually really, really cause government bodies to get very frustrated. So it's just these things that when I heard that this person was going to bring the fashion revolution to this region, I immediately was like, I don't know if you did your research. And even if you did, you are not the right person to be leading this work. You can be working, you can be supporting the work, but are you doing this work because you want the glory, the recognition, or because you are the one to do this work because you care? And I think this happens a lot when, Westerners come in and they care a lot. You can hear it in their voice, you can hear in the way they communicate, you can see, you can feel the passion. But that needs to be coming from a place of deeply rooted understanding that colonialism is the reason that many of these countries are in this situation today. And you as a Westerner coming in and, putting these band-aid solutions is not helping. It might provide some temporary solutions, but with an an industry as corrupt as fashion, it really has to be systemic changes that need to occur. And sometimes that needs to happen with the government body and you collaborating. And, just coming in and not understanding isn't really going to cut it. And I think the last thing I'll say in this is that there's many forms of change making activism that work in the Western world. examples of sitting outside parliament, protesting, doing artivism, which is combining art, maybe even doing different types of petitions. But one type of change making in a certain Western country does not mean it's going to work in a different region. In fact, it can be very, very different. And this is when we need to be realizing that unless we have robust, prior informed consent and consultation with the community you're trying to change, people cannot be coming in here and saying that this has worked in this region. So I'm going to come and try to do the same for you. Again, we need to stop the exploitation. They don't just need to be saved. It's really much more complicated than that.
So many good points there. And these are things that we definitely need to be aware of, not putting Western solutions as the solutions for the entire world, especially considering that it is Western colonizers and imperialists that have and continue to create many of the issues in these countries in the first place. So you've mentioned colonialism a few times, and I'd love to explore this deeper in the context of fashion. So, could you speak to how fashion's colonial roots have shaped the modern day realities of the industry today?
hmm So I think when we talk about colonialism, it's important to define it first of all, but also think about how are we embedded in these colonial structures, and sometimes not even understanding, we're not even knowing that we are. And colonialism is when the practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country. So we are still very much embedded within colonialism in the fashion industry, especially when it comes to economic dues and in the different business models that the fashion industry currently has. So right now, China in 2016 produced about 46% of the global textiles. So that's more than just clothing. That also includes like leather couches and snow gear, for example, and also couch covers and carpets. So when we talk about textiles, it's beyond just clothing. There's many different fabrics that go into play. Just want to make that clear. That's a lot. That's almost 50% just coming from one country alone. And Bangladesh is also very close, up about 8% in 2016 in US of what they're importing. Now Bangladesh is much smaller than China, and Bangladesh also has way less people than China. So how is it these two countries are really at the forefront of all this clothing production? Ding, 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 it's because of colonialism. And in the both of these two countries' circumstances, they were previously under control of the British India East Trading Company, in which some of them didn't really escape it until more recently. And in some circumstances, the government of these countries actually want the textile industry to be flourishing in these regions because they see all the different economic goods and all the different economic power it was bringing. In the case of China, because there's so much clothing made there, China is now really known as, that's where everything is made. And it started out in the 1800s, where lots of foreign imports from British India of cotton yarn created a very, very large market for weavers in northern China, which is interesting because the Uyghur population is currently being enslaved in northeastern China. So things are not that different than how they were about 200 years ago, even though we think they're very different. We just got better at covering it up, which is really, really shocking and really dismaying to hear. In terms of Bangladesh, it was mostly before trading muslin and also silk during the 16th to 18th century. And, like most industries in East Pakistan, which were owned by Pakistanis during the region, after that, lots of local Bengali entrepreneurs had set up their own large textile and also jute factories in Bangladesh, which later allowed a lot of British rules and different garment factories to set up there, and then later also export their products overseas. And another industry in Bangladesh that's very up and coming is something called RMGs, which is ready made garments. And they're essentially a finished textile product from the Bangladeshi RMG sector, which is one of the largest growing sectors in the economy in Bangladesh, with about 55% growth from 2002 to 2012. So as you can see, there's so much growth happening within these regions that sometimes we don't understand why that is. But the reason why they're there is because of colonialism. Now, I want to bring it back to something very important. So, 43% of clothing garments are made in China that are being, exported to the United States, and 7 to 8% in Bangladesh. So, and then some of the other countries are also Cambodia, Vietnam, Honduras, and Haiti. But where do the clothing go after we're done with them? Most people are thinking we're going to donate them. Maybe I'll swap them. Maybe I'll go into a local women's shelter. The truth is, about 90% of clothing you donate to don't get resold, especially after Marie Kondo really popularized does it spark joy, right? Marie Kondo Your Life movement in 2018. Some different donation centers in Australia actually experienced like over donations because people were donating too much. The problem with donation centers is that we think that everything gets resold or they get donated, or we have this very like fantasy like in our mind where people are using these products and we're helping someone in need. The reality is 90% of the stuff you donate does not get resold and they instead get shipped to places like Katamanto in Ghana. Katamanto is one of the largest secondhand resale markets in the world where they're getting tons, like thousands of tons of clothing in super duper large blocks, like a port sized block, shipped to their ports on a daily basis. And workers, more like volunteers or people that don't even get paid for any of their work, are spending 15 hours of their day sorting through these gigantic blocks of clothing. So here's pants, here's shirts, to later resell them. But we actually had Samuel from the OR Foundation who does work surrounding Katamanto in Ghana and making sure people try and get a living wage and raise awareness on the topic. He was saying that the clothing that comes in, there's all sorts of things on there, like blood stains, sweat stains, like food stains, like they're absolutely just torn apart. It's garbage. People are donating them, thinking that they're helping someone in need. What they're really doing is contributing to a diminishing textile sectors of many of Africa's largest countries, because this similar situation is happening in Kenya as well. And what they're doing is trashing their clothing to a point, thinking that they're helping out these people in these countries or in these regions because they're donating. What they're really doing is just throwing their stuff away and then letting someone else pick up the scraps. This is not donating. This is not helping people. This is actually ruining the local economy in Katamanto in Ghana. And it's also the case in the Philippines and also Haiti. So what do you notice? The clothing is made in countries like China and Bangladesh and Vietnam and Cambodia, countries in the global south, where people are working 15 hours and more a day, sometimes for free, making less than 10 cents an hour. What's even worse is there's actually textile and garment factories in New York that are mainly employing Chinese and Latinx women, right, in the United States, that are still paying them about 10 cents US an hour. So still slave wage labor. So even people of this geographic region, people of Chinese and Latina descent producing this clothing in the US overseas. So you have mostly women of color making these clothing in the global south. And if it's in the global north, they're still subject to various forms of abuse. And you have mostly countries in the global south, Philippines, Haiti, Ghana, and Kenya, taking most of our clothing donations. It is hugely colonial what is happening in the fashion ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Every aspect of it, from where it's produced to where it's dumped, it's all at the hands of the global south. What happens in the north? These capitalist models of consumption is really driven by our desire to consume, to have a new outfit, to look good. After the pandemic, Aja Barber, who's a great fashion activist, coined this term called revenge shopping, where we will see a huge uptick in people buying clothing because now you can travel. Now you can go to festivals. Now you can go out. It's going to happen. And I just shudder thinking about it because after I started working in this field, I really try to minimize my shopping habits. But it's hard to do so if a thrift store, right? It's like affordable and it's thrifting, so secondhand, so you're thinking that it's beneficial. But after you go thrifting, you have more clothes accumulated. Things get very cloudy when you have too many things. And this is why we're really telling people to view their clothes as stories and not commodities, because this overconsumption and this overcapacity of choice is something that's really hard for us to make more ethical decisions. And I know I'm kind of talking a lot about this because I'm very passionate about the subject area, but I'll just quickly mention that another example of this is India. So India has one of the most diverse and just like beautiful stories of textile manufacturing and also the local textiles economy. We have some of the coolest fashions in the world today. And what's happening is that with the digitization of fashion, the mechanization of looms, so looms are ones where you put the thread on and you're able to make certain types of clothing. That previously was a lot done by women or even men that was really sewing by hand, button making, seamstressing, and that's what really fueled their economy. But the rapid digitization of the looms and also of this growing demand in fast fashion has made a lot of the jobs where it's people actually creating the clothing go out of business because now it's all replaced by machines. And what's worse is that, a lot of these women that have such amazing artistic ability in sewing their clothing and also sewing for others, they have this skill that's no longer needed because they're quote unquote too slow because these big companies want this clothing at a very quick rate. And I think that's just so incredibly unjust that there's these women with these amazing sewing skills that can put a machine to shame that are no longer needed. So when we think about decolonizing fashion, there's a few different aspects. There's a labor aspect where we need to understand that we need to decolonize our understanding of labor from an intersectional lens, and that there's so many different layers of oppression in the industry. And when we are thinking about, solutions for an ethical industry and thinking about from the Western perspective, I've noticed a lot of language around how can we do XX to have the biggest impact and to drive, ensure we achieve the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. This kind of thinking in thinking how we do social change is inherently capitalist and you guessed it, colonialist, because you're thinking of how to get something out of someone else. When in reality, the fact that they have their cultural heritage, their significance, and they have centuries of lived experience of sewing and also of understanding how to do these different kind of sewing garment practices is really what's good enough to quote unquote drive impact, because these are the communities that have been here for millennia, who can speak the language, who knows best practices, and are people that really the ones that we should be listening to, not these huge fast fashion conglomerates that are saying we have a new conscious collection. Oh, and by the way, if you bring back your used clothing, we'll give you $5 to buy more. Like, when you just stop for a second, think about what they're promoting to us, it's kind of ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'll just end off with saying that the second aspect of decolonizing fashion is around the land aspect and realizing that we need to have a fundamental shift of how we see the land. So sometimes instead of, looking at the diagram and thinking like, how am I going to farm all this organic cotton? How am I going to make the next poly cotton blend? How am I going to cut down this old growth forest to make more plant-based materials because plant-based textiles are in right now? We cannot see our land as merely dead materials and something we have to extract from. These extractive models are the exact ones that are fueling climate change, that are fueling gross capitalism. We need to think about how we need to live in relationship and in harmony with the land. And, there's so many aspects of nature that are really in tune with how we should be thinking about fashion. Nature is really able to encapsulate how we feel in the moment and to take us back. And that's something about fashion as well. I have this jacket that I've worn to every single protest I've ever attended, and I'm probably going to wear it to every single protest ever will go to. That will be my protest jacket. That's a story, and that is how I think we need to be decolonizing fashion.
And that wraps it up for part 1 of this conversation with Sophia. Part 2 will be going live next week. This second part of the episode will focus a lot more on the solutions for building a more just, equitable, and intersectional sustainable fashion future. For the full transcript of this episode, as well as links to follow and learn more about Sophia and her incredible organization Threading Change, you can head on over to consciouslifeandstyle.com. The link to the show notes page should also be linked in whatever podcast app that you are using. If you'd like to spread the word about this show and help this content reach more people, you can share about the episode or this podcast with a friend. You can screenshot this episode and share about it on Instagram stories, tagging @ConsciousStyle. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, something that really helps is to leave a rating and review. And finally, for more conscious content, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Conscious Edit. In this newsletter, I share recommendations for reading, listening to, supporting, making, and much more. To get on that list, visit consciouslifeandstyle.com/edit. Thank you again for joining me for this episode and sticking around until the very end. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week.